before, it was down a little lower.
Okay.
Couldn't quite hear you very good.
Okay, up here somewhere. You could turn me up a little bit, I guess.
A little bit higher. Right, yeah, right in there.
Here somewhere.
That's good.
That better?
That's good, yeah.
Okay. Lord. We say good evening, we say good night, we say goodbye. Because good is good.
Amen.
And that's a thing to say to a person, because we would say bad evening and bad night because we don't have any idea to value bad upon people and bad upon ourselves. Words mean things. You question about moral law. Why? Wanted to add a couple thoughts from this morning, and then we'll get into our display over here. I said that moral government is like, or can be, we can use an analogy of baseball, where it's got boundaries and it's got rules, you got X number of bases, and you're supposed to hit the ball, and you're supposed to pitch the ball, and you get so many strikes and so many balls, and then you're on, and then you're out. And all of these rules and umpires to enforce the rules and things like that. Now, knowing the rules of the game tells us nothing about the players and how well they play, or how poorly they play, or what the scores are when the game is done, and who wins. It only tells us the structure of the game, but it doesn't tell us how the people do, how well they do, or how poorly they do. So with moral government, it's a structure or an understanding of our nature and relations, but it does not tell us how the people do with these moral nature and relations. It doesn't tell us how people relate to one another. It just tells us how we ought to relate to one another.
Right.
So your minds, as some I heard today, thinking on these things, they came up with various things that they would experience, seeing other people and how they lived, and they asked questions about, well, what about motives, or what about conscience? Was conscience involved, and things like that? Well, those are questions that relate to how people live in relationship to, or in this context of moral government. And there are many variations. There are some people whose desires are for this, but other people, they don't desire this at all. There are a lot of people who desire money because that's a means to give them entrance into certain social settings. And their desire is to get into social settings, but they know they have to make money for it. So they have a desire to make money to fulfill the desire to get into the social settings. But other people, they're not interested in money at all because their desires aim for something else that doesn't take money. Follow what I'm saying?
Amen.
So there's a multitude of different ways that people who live by the desires can be living out their selfishness, living by the desires. And it's not all just everybody lives the same way when they live by desires. But the moral quality of living by desires is the same in all of them. And that is selfishness, or sin, transgression of God's moral law. The quality or the character of their heart is the same. But the form of sin that people live in can just be so varied, just like baseball games. The scores can be so varied, and the number of outs and the performances can be so varied. But they all are constrained by the rules and regulations. So I wanted to point that out so that to help you think that when you're thinking of these matters, to realize that this is the underlying current or underlying structure of what's going on. For example, in our time, there is a lot of talk boiling up and getting into the common vernacular and common writings and speakings and things where people are saying we're entering into a postmodern age. Some people have said we have entered a postmodern age. And we have left or are leaving the modern age. And they have definitions what they mean by modern age. And then now they say we are past that. We're entering into the age that's beyond the modern age. And they have ways of trying to describe that. I submit to you that moral government transcends all different ages.
Amen. That's right.
I submit to you that the nature of man and his relationships in the modern age are the same as they will be in the postmodern age. Though ideas about things may change, everyone will have an intellect, sensibilities, and will, and the influences upon them of what they choose will come from the same sources.
Amen.
Either their intellect and reason or their sensibilities. However they may construct ideas about things or reject ideas of the past, everyone has the same moral nature, and we all have the same responsibilities in our relationships, and that doesn't change. And that was the same true in the medieval transient things that people claim are now what is reality. And this is very helpful to my thinking. This also transcends all religions. The people of the Middle East do not have a different moral nature, or
That's
do
right.
they have a different moral relationships than people in the West.
That's right.
And the idea of good is the same. Everyone has an idea of good. Now, it may baffle you to think that's so, but it is true, because that's the way God made us. Now, we take understanding what God made us and begin to think through how this would be so in these various circumstances, and I believe and I know for myself, it's very helpful to realize that this doesn't change, but how people live in rebellion against their intelligence and live by prejudice, or live by hatred, or live by their feelings of this or that, and do terrible things. It's because they live by their sensibilities, or their passions, or their fears. There's a lot of things that people do that are very harmful to others, deadly to others, because they live in fear. And they're acting out of their fear to preserve their name, or their identity, or their reputation. So out of their fear that they will lose something they value, belonging to a group, things like that. This is how gangs work. You belong to a group, and out of fear that they might be kicked out of the group. You know, there are many gangs that require that the person who wants to join the gang has to murder somebody as a condition. And their desire to be part of that gang is stronger than any sense of right and wrong at that point, and they reject the sense of right and wrong to fulfill the desire. And because of the desire to be in a gang so strongly. This does, in fact, teach us what reality is and explains human behavior if we understand the underlying cause of this. Otherwise, there is no explanation for human behavior. But you know what? If there's none, then there's no requirement that people behave in any particular way. So everybody's behaving as they ought to, or as they want to, and there's nothing wrong with that. So human governments that say murder's wrong, they're wrong. This is where it would lead to. Okay, let's continue on with where we were. And I'll try to go as fast as I can without leaving anything important out. We're at free will. That is the heart. That is that aspect of man that's under moral law. There are two laws, and only two laws. God made everything under law. Everything. Everything but man is under physical law. Physical law is that law of force, that law of cause and effect. That law that if you get this cause, you always get this effect. There's no liberty, there's no change. Trees do not have free will to decide when they're going to drop their leaves and turn brown and all that. It's all under physical law, the law of cause and effect, what we call the laws of physics. So everything God has created is under physical law, including you and I, to a degree. But He also created an element within us that is not under physical law, not under the law of force, not under the law of coercion, but is completely free, and that aspect of us is under what we call the moral law, which I'll explain in a minute. Intellect and sensibilities are under physical law, under law of cause and effect. They are involuntary activities of the mind.
Amen.
We do not choose to think. We are always thinking.
That's right.
We do not choose to have a conscience. We always have a conscience. We do not choose to be conscious or self-conscious of what's going on in our mind. That's always happening. That's under the law of cause and effect, or physical law. Sensibilities are under the physical law, or the law of cause and effect. When we think on a particular thing, all of a sudden we find ourselves having feelings about that thing, and we don't like those feelings, so we turn our mind away from that so we don't get those feelings and start crying or start fearing or something like that. So the will is capable of turning the attention of reason on whatever subject it wants to have the reason think on. The reason is always thinking, but the will can direct the attention of the reason to put its attention upon what I'm saying right now. And that's why you can pay attention to what I'm saying minute after minute after minute, because your will can control the attention that you put your mind upon. The will can control your reason. To think on what Dennis is saying, listen to what Dennis is saying, and you can keep your attention upon me because you have the will to do so, and you exercise that will. Now, the mind is always thinking, reason is always thinking, so that's why if you direct the attention, then you'll find yourself thinking on that thing, because the mind is always thinking. Now, the mind will oftentimes have certain feelings or desires or certain subjects to get certain feelings. The huge advertising business has learned this about our natures. That if you get their attention upon a certain subject and keep it there, maybe even 30 seconds, while you're saying things about that object, they'll get certain desires. Like a new car, a cell phone, anything that they want to sell. What they do is they get our attentions upon that object and stir up a desire to have that for some good reason that they can do. People will be proud to be with you with this item. People will be glad to be seen with you. You'll get ahead with this item. Don't be left behind. Get your own cell phone. And they appeal to the various things that people would fear or want to have in their life. That's how they sell things, by stirring up desire. They stir up desire by putting our attention upon a particular object and keeping our attention on it. And we live in an age when paying attention to something is becoming very scarce. Our attention span is about that long, and then it changes. And if you'll notice the advertisements that the advertisers are doing, they keep shifting the image to keep your attention. Because they know if they keep it on the same thing for 3 seconds, you're gone. That's what they're doing. They're keeping your attention because they understand our natures. Now, the sinner, he doesn't pay attention to the moral law. He doesn't pay attention to what reason would bring him to consider. He directs his attention to how to gratify his desires, how to keep from fearing when he thinks upon a certain thing or involved in a certain thing. So now the sinner brings his reason and makes it a servant of how to fulfill and gratify his desires. So that's how the sinner is living. He is committed to gratify whatever desire calls out the loudest for his gratification, and he brings the reason to become a servant. How can I? What's the best means to accomplish it? How can I do that tomorrow, what I couldn't do today, to get my desires gratified? So now the reason is serving the gratification of desires. The reason becomes a slave to the sinful heart, and is used by the heart to pursue its purposes according to its desires, or to stay away from things that it fears, things like that. Always promoting its own good. Now, the gratification of a desire is a good thing. It's, oh, that was nice. Ooh, that was good. And that's how we learn what the intrinsic value of good is through the sensibilities. So when a child is growing up and he begins to experience these gratifications of the sensibilities, you're feeding him, and he's around people, and he gets this idea. And when we get older, something happens. We get to target what desires will gratify, because that's the good we prefer. But when their child is young, you will find them eating this and drinking that and experiencing this, and it's all just delightful. It's all good, except the child gets a spanking. That wasn't good, but the child's learning something. Now, the child's learning something. He's developing in his mind. This is how God made us. He's developing in his mind and understanding the concept of something called good. And as these various experiences go together in his mind, he starts to piece it together. And by the means of these different desires being gratified, these feelings being gratified and experienced, he gets this idea that the intrinsically valuable, valuable in and of itself. And that's the idea that God made us to come up with. He made our natures to eventually come up with the idea that there is something intrinsically valuable, intrinsically good. And that's how we get that idea. But when we get the idea that there is something intrinsically valuable, we also, with that idea, develop that something is intrinsically valuable, that something should be something that everybody gets. Because it's intrinsically valuable. By intrinsic, I mean for its own sake. That there's something valuable that should be experienced by everybody for its own sake, because it's valuable. Are you with me on that?
Yes.
That when the idea of something that's valuable in and of itself or intrinsically valuable gets developed, the mind comes under obligation and knows that that is so intrinsically valuable, everybody should be getting it. And that's where the idea of moral law develops. That I ought to be involved in seeing that everybody gets this intrinsically valuable thing. It's called good. it's worth having. It's not worth having because it brings about something else. It is worth having because it is worth having because it is worth having. That's what intrinsic means. In and of itself, it is good. So the question that the moral law raises, and our understanding raises, is why should I promote that? Because it's good. Well, why should I promote good? This is a very key thing to understand. Why should I promote somebody who's good? Because it's good.
Right.
That's all. It was hard for me to get my mind around that the first time I began to read it, isn't it? This idea of intrinsically good, good for its own sake. That was a whole new idea to me. I was always pursuing good because it came to me. But just to do it for its own sake. And then I realized I couldn't do it the way I was doing it because I wasn't doing it just for its own sake. I was just doing it for me. For me to get that good. But when I began to see that good is intrinsically valuable and should be shared and is made to be shared with everyone, just for its own sake, then it began to catch the spirit of the moral law. That's what good is. You don't do it there's not an ulterior motive behind doing good.
That's right.
You do it because it's good. You don't do it because they'll be happy that you gave it to them. You just do it because it's good for them. You don't do it for them because something will come of it. That would be an ulterior motive. But love, which is what this law commands us to do or be, love is not done for an ulterior motive to get something in return. Turn to Luke chapter 6. Luke chapter 6. Luke chapter 6. Same thing is said in Matthew chapter 5. Verse 27. But I say to you who hear, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. Verse 31, just as you want people to treat you, treat them in the same way. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. If you lend to those from whom you expect to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners in order to receive back. But love your enemies and do good and lend expecting nothing in return. He is telling, if the world lends money to others to get something back. So big deal. Is that praiseworthy? No. The world loves those who love them. Is that praiseworthy? Jesus says no. What's praiseworthy is you love those who even are your enemies. You do good to those expecting nothing in return. You don't do good to those who do good to you. He says, Gentiles do that. There's no credit in that. We do good to others. Jesus teaches us to do good to others because good is good, expecting nothing in return. That is the motive that the moral law commands us. To do good for its own sake. That's what Jesus talked about. Doing good, doing good, doing good. The saint is a do-gooder.
That's right.
But he doesn't do it to get something back. He doesn't even do it to please God. He does it because good is intrinsically valuable, is worth doing for its own sake, and to get nothing back. Now, a state of mind, a state of heart that is in that state is a holy heart.
Amen.
And that's the heart of God. God is love. Jesus said, now it's been told you to love your neighbor and hate your enemies. I tell you, love your enemies. Imagine that. In other words, it doesn't say approve of your enemies. So many people think love is approval. They think love is approval. And when they find somebody who approves of them, they think that they're being loved by them. And many people construct their lives so that people will approve of them so they get what they think is love from people. That's all conditional.
Right.
Love is what is committed to promote the good of another for its own sake. It's a choice of the heart. It's a choice of the will. To commit to promote the good of another for its own sake. To get nothing in return. Nothing. And blessed is the person who is in that state of heart. live such a miserable life. He can never attain the good he's after because he's seeking to attain good through gratification of the flesh. Sensibilities of flesh being the same thing. It's like somebody who was trying to catch their shadow. Every time you take a step, the shadow is further away. The person, sinner who lives in gratifying his desires, he gratifies his desires believing it will make him happy. But when he gets done with gratifying the desire, he's not happy. He only gratified the desire. He got the money, he got the person, he got the promotion, but he didn't get the payoff, happiness. But when a saint who loves his neighbor, even his enemy, does good to them for its own sake, he's happy because he's accomplished what he's after, doing them good for no other reason. You with me?
Amen.
Yeah.
That's right.
I'll tell you, when I came under conviction through understanding this, among other things, I began to examine myself and my life and my motives, and I began to realize and saw within myself that everything I began to see that everything I was doing and touching was for one reason only. Did something for me. One day I went to pick up the phone to make a phone call, and when I picked up the phone, I realized, it was a realization moment. I was doing this, another thing, for one design. Did something for Dennis. And that made me realize that the slightest things that I was doing, picking up a phone to make a call, had selfish motives behind it. Because it was to accomplish something just for myself. Just for me. Just for Dennis. And that's the essence of self. That is selfishness. That's not holiness. God is not like that. God does not do things to gratify himself. He does good for its own sake.
Amen.
He sent his Son that we might have eternal life, that we might have the good of eternal life. And when somebody receives that good, God is delighted. There's so much rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents. Why are they delighted? Because they don't wait to see if that sinner does great things for God to be delighted. The sinner has received the good, and that's what God is after, to bring that good into that sinner. When that sinner receives the good, there's such rejoicing. Because God's heart is satisfied. He has accomplished what he is intending to do, and that is bring good to sinners. And God helped me to realize my motive. Through understanding these things, it helped me to examine myself, examine my heart in light of my behaviors, and to begin to examine my motives. As I began to examine my motives, I came to realize that I was totally selfish. Which was contrary to the moral law and God's law that says, "Thou shalt love God with all your heart, and love your neighbor as yourself." And my rule of living was to love Dennis first, promote my interests first, promote my good first. Now I'll get around to those other things. That's how I was living. I didn't realize it until I began to be awakened by God and look at and examine myself and see what my heart was really like, and given the tools to know what to look for. These are the tools that help me know what to look for. Now, somebody came to Jesus and said, testing him, said, what's the greatest commandment? What's the greatest commandment? We've got at least 10. Some Jews say they have 633, but what's the greatest commandment? They asked Jesus. And Jesus says in Matthew chapter 22 and Mark chapter 12, he answers them and says, the first commandment is, thou shalt love God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself is the second one. And those two together make up all the commandments and all the law and the prophets.
Amen. Amen.
You take all the law and the prophets and wrap them all up, and you bring out two commandments, and that says it all.
That's right.
So all the commandments that God has spoken to Israel, and all, the professors came and asked him this question. He says, look, wrap it all up in two things. Love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. That takes care of it all. We go over to Paul in Romans chapter 13. Let's turn there. Paul in Romans chapter 13. young people are challenged. What's the will of God for your life? You're supposed to go here, you're supposed to go there, become this, become that. Here's the will of God for your life. Love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. That's the will of God for your life and my life. And God will come and direct you how to apply that love here, and apply that love. God will direct you how to prepare yourself to love Him and carry out this love for Him, and what are the means to carry out this love for Him and love your neighbor. God will guide you by His Spirit because you're now one who loves Him and will receive His guidance and instruction. Those who love God are open to any instruction, any will He may have for their life. But that's the will of God for us. Loving God with all of our heart, mind, soul, and strength, loving our neighbor as ourselves. This fulfills the law. Paul says the same thing in Galatians. Love fulfills the law. Now that's really wonderful. Because it's totally within our power to love God with all of our heart, all of our soul, all of our mind, and all of our strength, and love our neighbor as ourselves.
Amen. That's right.
That love can be fulfilled in us and through us because we are perfectly capable of doing that. Are we not?
Amen.
Amen.
Fact. Every human being is a lover. Every one of us, every person in the world is a lover. God created us with such a nature that we cannot but love. The sinner's problem is that he loves himself above all. He's promoting his own good above everyone else's. He discounts the value of other people's good, well-being. He discounts the value of God's well-being, and he makes his the highest. So he makes himself the supreme object of love. His problem is, he's a lover, but he's loving the wrong person supremely.
Got it.
He's loving the wrong person with all of his heart, mind, soul, and strength. He's loving, but he's loving himself supremely. Love is the promotion of the good of somebody for its own sake. He is promoting the good of himself. He has distorted what the love is supposed to be, and he's zeroed it in upon himself. He's made himself the object of love. Therefore, although he's loving, it's breaking the moral law, which says, take your love and spread it out where it belongs. Conversion of the sinner is not from converting him from hating somebody, hating God, to loving God. It's to convert him from loving himself as if he were God, to loving God who is really God.
Amen. That's right.
That's the conversion of the sinner. God made us, and every person loves. It's impossible to not choose good as an ultimate end of life. It's impossible to choose evil as an ultimate end of life. I'm going to live for evil. It's impossible. It's contrary to the nature that God made us to have. It's only possible to choose good. Will we choose good and God's good supremely and my neighbor's good equal to mine, or will I choose good for myself above all? But the choice of good is the only choice God made us capable of having as an ultimate end. As an ultimate end, we can only choose good. Now those who choose their own good supremely, they begin to choose means to accomplish their own good supremely, and so they may choose things that are very evil upon other people, but they're trying to secure good. That's why you hear people, I killed him, of course, but I wasn't trying to. I wasn't aiming to. He just got in the way of my pursuit of getting this other thing. So the selfish person will end up killing people, not because he intends to do evil to people, but he has such passion and drive and commitment to get his own good that when people get in the way, down they come. Because he values his own life and good above anybody else's, as an example. Does this sound a little contrary to things you may have been thinking? Raising good questions, I hope. I trust it's answering some questions you've had, and I hope there's some clarity for you. Okay. We talked about consciousness this morning. That's the ability, this camcorder that stands above in our mind, and we can observe everything that's going on in our mind, and that's how we know what's going on in our mind. This ability called self-consciousness. This is illustrated in the Bible. Again, as I say, the Bible does expresses it. So when we find things written in the Bible, it's simply expressing things that are real for our knowledge. It's not creating anything that's real that it wasn't real otherwise. For example, in the Bible says, but Jesus, conscious that his disciples grumbled at this, said to them, does this cause you to stumble? Jesus, conscious of what they were thinking. It says in Hebrews, otherwise would they not have ceased to be offered, because the worshippers, having once been cleansed, would no longer have had consciousness of sin. The Bible expresses that there's this consciousness of sin that has to be addressed in redemption, reconciliation. Sinner is conscious of sin when he becomes convicted and pays attention to these things. Another word for consciousness is aware, but the woman, fearing and trembling, aware of what had happened to her, came and fell down before Jesus. She was aware. That was the power of self-consciousness working within her. She was aware that something happened within her. That's how she knew. This power called self-consciousness. But the multitudes were aware of this and followed him. Sometimes there's a group consciousness, or the whole group of people are conscious of the same thing. They draw the same conclusion, and they're conscious that this means this. And then it's a group, it's a public awareness of something. You know, when we try to get laws changed or something, they put on drives to change public awareness, they call it. Well, they're trying to bring a change of consciousness in people, or make them think something different so that they become conscious of the issue, or the problem, or the solution. So, in the way that our relations go, we understand that man has this ability of consciousness, and we try to develop it and use it to shift public opinion by what they call consciousness-raising efforts and things like that. This is just normal stuff that's going on. So that's the power of consciousness. The sensibilities we talked about this morning, it's the same thing that the Bible calls flesh. It's any form of sensation or desire or passions or fear or pain, anything we call feelings. This is under physical law. You cannot choose to have a particular desire by a direct effort of the will. I will now want ice cream. I will now desire this. That desire will not come up because you choose to have it. It doesn't work that way. These occur, the sensibilities occur, they rise up, we experience them when our attention is put upon an object that stimulates that feeling or that desire or that fear. Pastor was sharing this afternoon about an experience that a woman had, and that particular object in her mind was very fearful to her. And it continued in her until things began to settle down and situations changed for her. And so people fear things because their mind gets on a certain object and they fear that, and they can't. They just, for whatever reason, many people won't break away from it and put their mind on something else. Or there's other reasons for that too. They become enslaved to certain things. That's one evidence of it. There's also something else going on in the sensibilities. That's a constitutional thing. It's made in there. And that's what's called a constitutional self-love. God made within us what is called a self-love. It's constitutional, built into us. This self-love, and it goes with what I said earlier, when this self-love, this self-seeking of good, when we're small, develops the idea of the good. And it's through this constitutional self-love that we develop You ever been in a mall and you see a sign that says, "You are here"? I saw a cartoon about that once. Two ladies standing there looking at that sign that says, "You are here," and one said to the other, "They know where we are." This is you. You are here. This is you in obedience to God. This is you loving God with all of your heart. This is you loving your neighbor as yourself. Okay? You're committed to believe and obey the truth as your reason understands it. In this state, the body is the servant of the truth as perceived by the reason. In an unconverted state, the body is served by the reason. The body, along with the sensibilities of the mind, is served by the reason. When a person is converted and loving God, the body serves what the reason is obeying. What the heart is obeying, the reason is dictating. Paul talks about, "I keep my body under." I pray therefore that you would commit your bodies, what was it, 1 and 2?
Present your body as a living
Present your
sacrifice.
bodies as a living sacrifice. The body becomes subject to the heart that's committed to in obeying the reason. This is a holy heart. Is it not? That would be a holy person, a holy mind, a holy heart. So in this state, the heart has committed itself through the influence of the truth, which we will talk about soon, influence of the truth of their nature and relations and the gospel. Under those influences, it has examined itself, it has observed its motives, it has observed its heart, it has come under conviction, etc., until he is turned to love God with all of his heart, under the influence of the gospel and his reason. So now the heart of man is committed, it commits its whole being to obey what the reason perceives to be the truth regarding his nature and relations and his responsibilities thereof. Sensibilities are subject to reason. They are not obeyed for any good reason. There's no good reason to obey them. So what is obeyed is the truth. So now the sensibilities are not the object of obedience, but they are now subject to the decision of the heart as to how that heart shall live, and it often just says no to the sensibility. Sometimes it says yes when the sensibility says, "I'm hungry, and oh, I haven't eaten today, I better eat because it would be good to eat, to keep my body well for God's service." So it eats for that reason, but the appetite reminded him that he hadn't eaten. So now he takes consideration, he says, "Oh, I haven't eaten, but I should not eat today because of this good reason." And so there's that interaction between the sensibilities and the reason, but reason is always in control and deciding whether or not to gratify any of the desires, whenever there's a good reason for it. So the intellect has the input of the truth, light as we call it. The will has yielded to that influence. Now everything is under the influence of truth and the light, and this is an obedient servant of God. In this state, the conscience is now in a state in which it looks at the state of the heart and sees it in a state of commitment to love God with all of its heart, love its neighbor as itself, and the conscience now smiles, takes delight in what it sees.
Amen. That's right.
The conscience now delights in what it sees, and it praises what it sees. It pronounces blessing upon what it sees. It sees what it sees as praiseworthy, and so it gives praise to the state that it sees, the state of holiness. Isn't that blessedness.
Right.
That's happiness. That is the good that is intrinsically valuable to have. That is the good that God created us all to have and be in a state of such satisfaction that we're fulfilled. We're blessed. That's the good that the sinner does not have, does not possess, but God is seeking to bring it to him. God is seeking to bring to the sinner the resolution to is such dissatisfaction of mind. He's tormented in his mind. He's dissatisfied with life. He's driven to despair. He's driven to hopelessness. He's driven to suicide. There's no reason to live anymore because it's all falling apart and it's all burdensome and it's all painful. And God has sent his Son to seek and to save that which is lost.
Amen.
To bring to that person a state in which they are happy. They are blessed. Every time Jesus talks about blessed are those and blessed are those, he's talking about this state of happiness, a state of satisfied mind. That's what blessedness is. How oftentimes in the Old Testament you say, blessed be the God of Israel. They pronounce blessings upon God because he's a blessed being. His mind is totally satisfied. He is doing everything that his infinite reason and wisdom dictates to him to do. He's leaving nothing undone. Yeah. His conscience delights, praises his own sound, delights in his own state of mind.
Amen.
And he delights in every state of mind that is that way. That's a state of holiness. That's a state of mind called holiness. Holiness only exists in a state of mind. It doesn't exist in physical things or what we do externally or forms that we do or rituals that we do or doing this and not doing that just to not do it or do it. But holiness exists in being in a state of mind like that. So in reality, to seek to promote the well-being of another, the intrinsic good for them, will never be accomplished by any other means than bringing them into a state of holiness.
That's right. Amen.
That's why Jesus said, go out into all the world, make disciples of every nation. Because that's the only way they're going to have satisfaction of mind. That's the only way there's going to be good in them. Good to them. Is when they become holy. It's wonderful to send money to Africa when they're starving or wherever they're starving or wherever there's poverty, wherever there's pain, wherever there's suffering. It's wonderful to relieve that suffering, do the good that we can in that regard. But the ultimate good is to bring to that every soul the message of the gospel under the influence of the Spirit and draw them into a state of loving God and giving them a satisfaction state of mind that is their true good that God needs to have. So these other projects of relieving suffering and pain are worthwhile projects. But the ultimate good that the church is here to do is to bring people into a state of holiness to God, into a state of loving God with all their heart and loving their neighbor as themselves. This is the whole design of bringing us to salvation. That is, us into a state of holiness, into a state of loving God with all of our heart, so we can enjoy the blessedness that he enjoys. That's his whole design for you and for me, is to bring us through the truth. He can never force us. He can never coerce our wills. But it's through the force of truth, the motive of truth, laying out the truth before us. Jesus came to reveal the Father. He sent the Spirit to lead us into all truth, so that by the truth and through the truth and the revelation of the truth about what is true about God, we come to reconsider, and then we come to repent, and then we come to believe. And through believing, God sends His Spirit, and you know that the conscience that is consciousness of sin. A person, you and I, can never have this blessing until that consciousness of sin is addressed.
Right.
Because the mind won't be satisfied. Do you know what the blood of Christ does?
Cleanses us.
Cleanses us.
Oh.
Cleanses our conscience from dead works.
Amen.
Because God knows that has to be dealt with. Folks, when people stop sinning, it's not conscience is still condemning them for their past life in rebellion. And that has to be cleansed through the blood of Christ before they can have a state of mind of blessedness. Just the same way if a person's been sinning and they see they need to stop sinning, it's wrong to sin, and they're selfishness, and they decide they're not going to sin anymore. And let us say that they actually stop sinning. They will not by that be accepted of God. Just by the fact that they stop sinning. Because they have a whole history of sin that must be forgiven.
That's right. Amen.
Under the law, they are still condemned for everything that up to that moment that they have been guilty of, unless they get reconciliation through the blood of Christ. That past sin, if they should stop sinning now, will send them to hell. Because that's what it deserves. It's instant. So there's more than just getting people to stop sinning. They must stop sinning for the right reason. Not to avoid hell, not just because it's wrong, but because of the reasons given by the gospel. People try to stop sinning so they don't go to hell. That's a selfish motive. God didn't create the church to keep people out of hell. He created the church to bring people into holiness.
That's right. Amen.
People walk in holiness and are forgiven and accepted through His grace and through the blood of Christ do not go to hell. But that's not why He sent His Son, to keep us out of hell. He sent His Son to do good to us, and that good is a state of blessedness and life. So really, when we love God with all of our heart and love our neighbor as ourselves, when we really love our neighbor as ourselves, and we're committed to promote the intrinsic good for him or her, that necessarily, when we understand it, means we're living and aiming to bring them to a state of holiness through the gospel.
Amen. That's right.
And that's what God does for us. If we have the love of God in our heart, that's what we will live for. To bring them into a state of holiness. Because God is interested in seeing people live a blessed life now. And having it shed abroad throughout the whole world. And I don't know what your view of prophecy is, and I don't know what view of pessimistic ideas you might have about the world, but that's what's in the mind of God to achieve. Is the holiness of every person in the world. That's what His aim is. That's why He sent His Son. That's why He commissioned the church. Go out and make disciples of all nations.
Amen.
That's what the moral law commands. It commands that we love God with all of our heart. That's the law. Jesus said everything's summed up in those two commandments. Love God with all of our heart, mind, soul, and strength. And love our neighbor as ourselves. That's the sum total of the law. It is something that is subjective, something we know in our own mind, that's what we're obligated to do. But it's not merely subjective, it's also objective, because it's something that God in His mind knows, that He made us to be that way, and He commands us to be that way. So it's not a matter of subjectively somebody saying, gee, I think, for me, I'm supposed to love God with all my heart, but I don't know about you. No, it's subjective in our own minds, and it's objective in God's mind, and He commands it. It's a law of liberty, law of choice. It's a law that's perfectly suited to our natures and relations.
Amen.
Our natures are made to love God with all of our heart and love our neighbor as ourselves. In fact, it won't be happy in doing anything else.
That's right.
That's the only thing our natures were made with. It's to love God with all of our heart and love our neighbor as ourselves. That's why He made our natures the way they are, because they'll only be blessed when we do that. Somebody said a car is made to run on gas, and man is made to run on about the immense power that this creator must have. And something about the fact that he's an intelligent creator. And that he creates things that are good, things that we see and are beautiful. So he must be able, he's created things that to us are beautiful. So he must have a mind that understands beauty, and must have a mind that can create us to enjoy that beauty. And he must have a mind that's intelligent, because we see intelligent design. He must be a being that is really benevolent, because we look around and it's just enjoyable to us. And things like that. And Paul says that men are without excuse. Now, the relationship part of this is that what man can see in creation tells him there must be somebody out there that did it. That puts him under obligation to figure out, what do I owe that person?
Right.
Do I owe him anything? Should I at least give him a thank you card? Don't I owe him something? Shouldn't I find out if I owe him something or not? But he's under obligation now to do something in relation to what he perceives to be the creator behind creation. I'll give you another example. Here's a man, he lives on a desert island, all by himself, been living there for a long time by himself. He comes out of his cave one morning, and he sees breakfast on a tray. And he eats that breakfast, and well, that was good. Puts the tray out there, and the next morning he comes out, the old tray's gone, new tray's there, and there's breakfast on it. Now, it's impossible for him to avoid the conclusion he has to draw.
That's right. That's right.
There must be somebody else here who can cook breakfast.
Right.
That knowledge puts him under obligation to relate to that person somehow. If he decides to ignore that person, that's a decision. And that's the relationship he has decided to have, is have no relationship with that person. But that's a decision, and that decision has moral quality to it. Because he's deciding how to relate to that person. When there is more than one person around, when there's more than just you that you can see around you, you come under obligation to make a decision how you're going to relate to them. Because you know they're there. That's the relationship I'm talking about when I talk about nature and relations. When you know I'm here, and I walk by you, and you know that I'm walking by you, and you choose to ignore me and go like this, and not talk to me when saying hi would be appropriate, that's a decision you made. That's how you chose to make our relationship at the moment. That's how you chosen to relate to me at that moment. Now, we're obligated to relate to one another with love.
Got it.
Do one another good. Acknowledge their presence, acknowledge their existence, acknowledge that they are moral beings who we have an interest in and would seek to do them good. Now, what would that entail? If I see a person that I know walking by me, what would that entail? At least an acknowledgement of their existence? Some acknowledgement. That's why saying hello and saying goodbye and answering questions and things like that is all part of being kind and acknowledging other moral beings, because you've chosen to relate to them in a good way. But if you won't talk to your neighbor, you've chosen to not relate to them. You've not chosen to not relate to them. You've chosen to relate to them in a way that is not benevolent. But you cannot ignore the fact that you're relating to them. And that's part of the moral obligation aspect that we're going to talk about. That because other people exist, you are obligated to choose how you will relate to them, and you cannot avoid that. You will either relate to them out of love for them and their well-being, or you will ignore them, or you will use them to gratify your own desires and your own ends. But you will relate to them. All of us are relating to everybody else in this world. You can say, well, I'm not relating to the people in France. I don't know the people in France. I never go over to France. But we are required to be in a state of commitment to promote their good, even if we never get a chance to carry it out. We're to be in that state of mind, that state of heart. We're to be committed to promote the good of all moral beings wherever we know they may exist. If we don't know they exist, we can't be committed to promote their well-being. Example, let us say that you live in a facility where you could see out a window, but you could never contact the outside world. They couldn't see it. And you look outside and there's people. You can never contact them, they can never contact you, they don't even know you're there. But we are obligated, since we know there's people there, to be in a state of commitment to promote their good, even if we're not able to carry that out. That's the state we're to be obligated to be in. We're to be in a benevolent heart towards anybody we know that exists, even if we can't carry it out. there's God, obligates us to say, how am I going to relate to this? We can't say I'm not going to relate. So our only choice is, how am I going to relate to this being? Does he have requirements of me? And if we think on it, we will realize that if I were God, I would require people to inquire what I expect of them, how I made them, what I require of them according to how I made them. Wouldn't you? Don't you suppose that you have in your mind that your children ought to inquire how they ought to behave at home and relate to their siblings and what you expect of them? Isn't that natural? And so it is true with God. It's a natural conclusion we draw. God, what do you expect of me? And our own intelligences inform us. He expects for me to consider him according to the reality of what he is, and that he is greater than I. And his happiness is more important than mine, more valuable
Right,
than mine.
amen.
And that comes out of our intelligence, our thinking, that we would conclude that. And therefore we're obligated to live according to that conclusion. Put his interests above ours because they're more important than ours, because he is greater than I. That's why I say this moral government and moral law comes out of our nature and relations. The way God made us, we end up knowing good is better than bad, and that we owe something to those that we know exist. It's like a person who's been living on a farm in the middle of somewhere. He's never seen a human being in his life. And all of a sudden somebody comes up down the road and he sees somebody pull up and start building a house, and now he's faced with a necessary decision. Do I go say hi, or do I ignore him? But he can't make no decision. He's forced to make a decision. So our natures and relations require us, demand of us, and it's unavoidable and unescapable that we choose how we're going to relate to one another. And if you think about it, we know we ought to relate to others as we would have them relate to us. That's how we ought to. But when people live by their sensibilities, they rather use people to gratify their sensibilities, to secure their ends, rather than recognizing the other person as somebody to love rather than somebody to use. The world uses one another. We might say the world loves money and uses people. God's people are to love people and use money for his kingdom. So that's the essence of love. It's not some supernatural disposition that's imparted to only the elect. This moral law is a requirement not on Christians, but on all
That's right.
moral beings.
Amen.
Got it.
Boy, was that a revelation to my mind. Somehow I thought that this is what the will of God was for Christians, is to love God and love our neighbor. But, when you become a Christian, then you're obligated, but until you become a Christian,